So now we're going to be looking at Unit 2. The first section, 2.1, is dealing with schools and school signs. So that will be the next area of conversation that we're going to go into, is being able to ask people, where did you go to school? What kind of school? I mean, I guess we could ask what school you're in right now, which is not really useful amongst ourselves. But once you go out, it will probably be a very handy piece of conversation to have to describe what Kent State is like. And then the further units, you can see what else we'll be going into. Oops. So the snapshots are, there's a video about fingerspelling names, how to do an apostrophe, because there are two different ways we can do it, and they can be a little bit confusing. And then what are higher education institutions? When we're fingerspelling names, one of the things they're going to talk about are how do you do prefixes like MC, MAC, O, and prefixes like Saint Mary's and things like that. So that's that first video. And it's a pretty good video, pretty clear explanation. Schools. We'll go through a bunch of different vocab for different types of secondary schools. And so those are the two right there, schools and school types. Then school choices, specifically for deaf students. What are the main ones that we have for deaf students? Then we talked in the previous chapter about cardinal numbers, the numbers you count with that are used for counting. Now we're going to get into ordinal numbers, which are sequencing. So like first, second, third, fourth. In a sense, it's how we're applying numbers. We're actually using the numbers as opposed to just stating them. So we'll talk about that. And then specifically, how do we apply them to like grades, first through 12th grade? And then where you rank, and we're going to use list for where you are, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, that kind of thing. And then there's a bunch of conversation starters. So what I want you to do is take a look at the PowerPoint and look at what they are, and then use these to practice with a friend before, after class, outside of class, whatever. These are good things to work with. And if you're practicing with a roommate or a friend who's not taking ASL classes, you can still teach them that, and you can sign and have a conversation. It will be redundant and boring because you're saying the same information that you already know, but it's really good practice to be able to have it ready in case you meet a deaf person who actually asks you these questions. We've got some ASL activities that we can do in the classroom, and then we'll get a little bit more into higher ed, post-secondary education, different college programs, grad programs, things like that. A common mistake that happens when signing college that they will we'll go into, there's a snapshot for that. More conversation starters, some facilitating group discussions and activity, and then review. So fingerspelling names. So this is a sign for fingerspelling. We've used that before now. So it's just wiggling your fingers and doing a circle. The video that explains it using MC, MAC, O, MC and MAC are treated as separate words. So the same rules apply that we use for regular fingerspelling. MC, man, McMahon, or McDonald's. So MC, pause on that letter, MC, pause on that letter, and then DONALD. There's actually no apostrophe, if I remember correctly. So Mick, Mac. I don't think there are any other ones we do besides like O, because it's a separate word. O'Malley, and you don't have to go, for a long time. MALLEY. And the other one they talk about is if it's Saint, something like if a school has St. period Mary of the swamps or something like that. We won't do a period. This is the sign for period, like St. period. We don't bother with that because St is enough. St. Mary of the swamp. Swamp. SWAMPS. Swamps. You get malaria there if you go. So that's a good overview of how to do those little prefixes that we'll oftentimes see. The next is an apostrophe. And the two that we're really talking about are if you see St. Mary's, like Mary apostrophe S, like St. Mary's of the swamp, versus Mary's shoes, as in your fellow student Mary, and her shoes are very nice. We would treat these differently. The title, St. Mary's, and instead of going YS, you're going to do a little twist. That shows it's apostrophe S, almost like you're grabbing it. St. Mary's of the swamp. No, it's just one swamp. It's spread. Versus, if you're talking about Mary's shoes, Mary, you would just sign her name, her shoes. So the apostrophe S is actually this. It's the hers. So just be aware you're going to skip over Mary. Eyebrows up of, you know who I'm talking about, Mary? You know, she with the curly red hair that Charlie Brown likes, Mary. Mary, her shoes. And eyebrows up because you're now talking about that. All right. So Mary, her shoes. Cool. Usually a nod as well. Pause this for just a second. Okay. So the next thing is higher education institutions. So here's a sign for college. And it's two closed fives, right? The fingers are closed. Don't do it with a C, college. That's a very English sign that you'll get hit for. Even if you do it in your dorm room, expect me to throw an eraser at you, that kind of college. So it's college. And if you think about it, we use this sign for school. Like, so paper, book, whatever, paper. The next level up from where you're in high school, secondary school, is the college level, collegiate level. Okay, so college, next level up. And we could talk about all the different universities. In ASL, the main ones we will see either are local to wherever the deaf community is. So Kent State, Tri-C. It's worth knowing the different schools in this area. Initially, just fingerspell them. I can add in a couple more. Some of the ones I'm about to mention, you've probably never heard of, but they're some of the most popular places for deaf students to go to, because either they have special services for deaf students through experience, or they're a deaf school set up for students. So the first one, CSUN, California State University at Northridge. That is in California. It's one of the state universities, and it has a deaf education program and a number of programs for ASL and deaf education. I believe it probably even, I think it has an interpreting program as well. I'm not 100% sure. There's Ohlone College, so you can college, university. Fingerspelling most of these. Lamar University. Sometimes you'll see people do a U for university. A lot of them will use the Southwest College, Southwest Collegiate Institute for the Deaf, SWCID. Institute, we normally see this as the sign. It's school, but with the letter I. Now, it looks initialized. What it is, it's used to refer to a school for the deaf, specifically for the deaf, and we will get to that when we're talking about secondary, different styles of secondary class or schools. McDaniel College, NTID, and that's part of RIT, and Rochester Institute of Technology. And then there's Gallaudet, Gaudet, and the sign name for Gallaudet is this. And it comes from glasses. The first president of Gallaudet wore glasses, and his last name was Gallaudet. So actually, the school was the Columbia School for the Deaf and Blind, I believe. That was how it was initially established, and eventually it changed its name to Gallaudet. And Gallaudet is in D.C., Washington, D.C., and it's got this distinction of being the only deaf university in the United States, potentially in the world, I believe. Many deaf students from around the world, or people interested in deaf education or sign language education, will go to Gallaudet. I heartily recommend, if you have access to a car, to try to make even day trips to Gallaudet and just look around, go spend the weekend. It's a really fun place, and it's when you walk away going, I just had my first conversation at Gallaudet, it's a real good feeling. It can be tense, even just going in and eating in the food court. It's worth it, looking around. Maybe even talking to the admissions people about potential grad school, even if you don't have an intention of going, just to find out more information. It's worth it. And taking a tour of campus. Okay, so nursery school and daycare are both fingerspelled. I should probably put a little asterisk in there, but you wouldn't want to say nurse, because this is like a nursing school, or like a nursing home. And that's what nursery for, little kids. So for preschool kids, preschool is a different one. So nursery, daycare, day care. I've seen daycare, or daycare. Day. Here's the day. Boop. Care. This is time for care for, 2 Ks. It's like work, because someone has to work at taking care of your kid, right? Daycare. So daycare. I've seen that one too. The book in their vocab thing, see, what's the sign? Fingerspell. Preschool is before. So remember that timeline? So we're going to go behind us. Preschool, before school, or fingerspell, preschool. This is actually pretty easy, much easier than like this. Kindergarten, 2 different signs. Kindergarten, so it's under here. So here's school, and it's under the school, or kindergarten. In context, waving the K makes sense because there's really no other words that start with a K. Oh, this is hard to see. Hold on, let me see if I can move this down. No, I can't. Okay, I can put that up there. Okay, elementary school, similar idea with kindergarten. Elementary school. I think look at the what's the sign for to see the different variations on elementary school. Junior high, JR. High school, HS. JR, HS. And then middle school, or middle. So either with the full hand or just the middle school. Because what I'm doing is, this is the middle, right? In the middle of my hand. So I draw the circle and then I go to the center. Middle school. High school, HS. High school. This kind of looks like a U. It's just a tilted HS. High school. Basic adult education, continuing education. We're going to do this and push it forward. So if this is the now line, it's moving forward. So continuing education. Vocational school, VOC. So public school has a couple different variations. Look at what's the sign. In general, hearing school, because most of the time that's what they were designed for, and deaf people have a hard time accessing services. So public school, general school can be, I've seen this like the local school. So take a look at what's the sign for public schools. Charter and also boarding would be fingerspelled. So charter school or boarding school. Parochial school, a religious school, it's an R, and it goes from, well, technically it's like supposed to be from the heart, but most of the time it comes from the right pectoral muscle. Religious school. Private school, you take your thumb and put it up against your mouth. It's like the private school. Right, so private school. And homeschool, homeschool. For most deaf students going into secondary, there are very few options. They can go to a charter school, something that's either specifically for a topic, specifically for deaf students, could be for students with multiple disabilities. So that's one option, if there's something that's special, that's not just the general public school. There's also a residential school for the deaf. And I would say think about it like Hogwarts. For the longest time, it was where deaf students they would be sent to Columbus for the Columbus School for the Deaf, and they would stay there from day one of the semester to the first holiday and then go home, or long weekend, go home. If they lived close by, they may be able to go home for weekends. If they lived far away on the other side of the state, they may be there till Christmas. They may be there till the end of the school year. It depended on the school and what they offered. But Hogwarts is probably the best explanation for what it was like. And that was, we normally call it a deaf school, deaf institute. Many of them had like the Oregon State School for the Deaf, or Florida State or Florida School for the Deaf, those kind of things, institute. And within deaf culture, that for the longest time was the hugest connection between people. Like, oh, which school? Where did you go to school? Because generationally, people who went to the Ohio School for the Deaf tended to stay in Ohio, and their kids went to the School for the Deaf, and on and on and on. And you could have multiple generations of OSD students within a family. So deaf school, you wouldn't say a hearing school or general school. Regional day school for the deaf. This would be one. Phoenix, Arizona has the Phoenix Day School for the Deaf, PDSD, and its students will usually, I believe, go to their home school, not their home school, their local school, and then would get on a different bus and go to the day school for the deaf. So oftentimes you'll see regional. So here's the student and here's the neighborhood around them, regional, or the city around them. Deaf school. And it's not a this because they're really not living there. Sometimes you'll see this for like regional R. I think that's one of the variations they show in the slideshow. So public school. I think open school is another one that we've seen. There are two different approaches within the schools. There's the mainstream school, which is generally one deaf student and a whole ton of hearing people all crammed together. That may have been what your experience was at your high school. If there was one or two deaf students, that may be how it is. It's mainstream. This tends to be a negative sign. People who are advocates for it will do mainstream. Look, they all mingle together. But the reality is, how many deaf students did you know in your high school? Did they fully integrate, or did they have a challenge? I mean, even if they have an interpreter with them, you've now got a sixth grader and an adult who's their interpreter walking around the school together. How easy is it for that person to make friends and have open conversations if they've got to go through an interpreter? So mainstream schools are not always the best situation. They sometimes are seen as better academically than, say, a residential school. But a lot of parents didn't want to send their kids across the state and not see them during the week, which makes some sense, right? In fact, when students would go to the residential schools for the deaf, like the Hogwarts, they tended to have a lot more kinship to their peers, would see dorm counselors, deaf adults, as being more like parents than their biological parents, because most biological parents couldn't sign. So they would go to school and they had people they could sign with, talk to, ask advice, blah, blah, blah. Go home, nothing. Gesture, try to talk, write. Not always a good situation. The other sort of option, so you got the mainstream, the solitary inclusion, is you can have a mainstream situation, especially if there are more than one deaf child, but they could have a separate classroom. So mainstream, but the deaf have their own classroom, a self-contained classroom. These oftentimes have like multiple disabilities all put into one place. That can be a real challenge if you have a particularly brilliant deaf child who's put into the self-contained classroom and is with people with developmental disabilities and feeling like they can't learn anything. There are many stories in the history of deaf education of absolutely brilliant students who, because they couldn't speak and write English, were seen as seen as developmentally disabled. And when they finally got language, then all of a sudden they blossomed and people were amazed. Language deprivation is a really interesting topic to follow, and how that can affect a child later in life as they become an adult. Anyway, so now we're going to look at ordinal numbers, the first, second, third, fourth, etc., how we apply numbers. So first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. All you're going to do is twist it. First, second, third. And my wrist isn't breaking. It's just, well, not breaking, but my wrist isn't bending. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. You don't have to do first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. And then grade, Grade. This is one, if you're going to be doing that a lot, like if you're going into secondary teaching, you're going to want to feel comfortable fingerspelling grade as one word, not grade, right? So grade, Grade. Actually, it's Grade. Grade. And then 10th, 11th, 12th grade. Grade. So class status, freshman to senior. So the easiest way is you're going to do a list. And we're going to start from the thumb as the oldest, the senior. I'm a senior. And we always do it with this. We don't do it with the index finger. It's this. Senior. And then junior, you can do a 5 or a 1. This next one down. Junior. Sophomore. Again, either hand shape. Freshman. You can also do, people will sometimes sign rat for freshman. I don't see it that often. I feel like there are lots of schools that have nicknames. I don't remember which school it was that signed diaper, like this, but diaper for freshmen. Diaper. So they had their own kind of, I don't know, nicknames for the different levels. Rat, I think, is what they call them at Gallaudet. Freshman. So nice, right? Then junior, you can fingerspell JR, junior, junior. Senior is always like this. The pinky is used for preparatory. And it comes from the fact that there are a lot of deaf higher education programs that have found that there's a real need for usually specifically math and English, that deaf students are graduating, are being passed on and really not being grounded in English and math at the collegiate level. So many programs will have a preparatory program that will focus the whole year on English and math. So that's why preparatory is the pinky. Freshman is the ring. So here are some conversations that you can have. You know all the pieces of this. And if you watch the videos for the conversational starters, you're going to see these. So elementary school and so you could say like, name your elementary school what? Or elementary school you go, name what? Type, remember we learned type? What type of school was it, or is it? There's also a question of if you take someone and put them in somewhere, like if your child, or what type? So which would you choose to put your child in? And there are lots of different variations, like anything you would want to ask someone about. Here we'll hopefully in class be able to talk about your high school. What was it like? Your high school. There's a sign for experience, which is this. It's kind of like you're petting yourself, but you're closing the hand. Experience. That was an experience. So high school experience, what? Like high school? Another question could for those people who like peaked in high school, right? Activity. 2 C's. Activity, action. High school. Or you could say your favorite thing to do. High school. What? Okay. So now we're starting to play with interchanging these different signs. It is going to be weird because we tend to think of the English word for stuff. So we'll introduce more ASL isms or idioms. So lots of different activities we'll do in class. Oh, excuse me. Hiccups. Post-secondary. So here's some of the different post-secondary things that we can sign. So we've got community. Now this is the sign for city. And it's house, 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 house. The sign for house is this. So you draw everything but the bottom. House. So we've got community or city. It's many houses put together. Community, college. We did college already. College. Small college, big college. University, or, I mean, I think it's probably safe to say you can do university because it's a specific kind of college. And the sign for graduate is this. It's like the G fell over and you're picking it up and standing it up. Graduation. You are now in your adult life, right? Graduated. Graduating. The sign for grad program or graduate student would be this. Why? Because we've got freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. And then after your senior year, you go to grad school and it could be a number of years. So it could be, say, 2 years. So we're adding to the top of the list, graduate school. And then like a PhD program. And you're just fingerspelling that. Enroll. Enter. So here, I'm just entering. Enter. You can apply. So I'm just this is like an electric plug that you're plugging in. I'm going to apply for something. Sometimes you'll see this for apply. This is like, volunteering for something or putting yourself forward for something. I'm going to apply. But I think this tends to be more because you're sending stuff in. Apply. Graduate school. Law school. So if this is like a book, L. These are the laws. Law school. Lawyer. Medical. Take the middle finger and put it in the middle of your palm like a mortar and pestle. You know how you grind up spices and grind up medicines and stuff. Medical school, med school. So here's the review that, don't use a C for college. Do the flat hands. I should add, or I'll throw an eraser at you. So what type of post-secondary institutions have you attended? So putting those together, what kind or where? College, go where? Go. And a couple of variations. If you watch the videos for the conversation, you'll see how they do it. Why? Take up, right? Take the class. Why learn ASL here? Why? Right? What do you think you're doing learning ASL here? That kind of thing. And then another group discussion where we could do in class. And we're just going to free flow the conversations about, have you transferred? Here's a sign for transfer. Here I was sitting there studying, and now I've moved over to this chair at this college, right? Transfer, or move. And what types of challenges do you think deaf people face when attending in college? We can talk about this in class. It'll be a little bit easier to sign some of the stuff. I would really love to be able to bring in a deaf guest or do something maybe through Zoom so that someone can talk about their experiences and get a deaf student to come in. We'll see what we can do with the given limitations. More potential activities. And then I will include in here the vocab-lists. Just to kind of refresh. So I'll put those in there, and I'll go back and do the previous chapters too. So that is 2.1. So look at all of those signs for school-related activities and labels. Awesome.